and good morning. So thank you for having me. It was wonderful listening to the minister, but to be frank with you, I have no disagreement with anything that was said because I didn't understand as well as I wish I could. You're sitting in one of the most amazing moments in healthcare, and we're seeing a transition which is occurring, as each and every one of you knows, in an industry that we are now beginning to call an industry. Because before we were a collection of cottage-based practices, small environments that have now been coming together in the last 15 years. And it feels almost every day that we're sitting on one of these, a seesaw. And we all played on them, I'm sure, at one time or another, or maybe recently and don't want to admit it. But the seesaw we're facing every moment is this balance between bringing innovation and new technologies into a healthcare environment, where at the same time we have all of these processes that are designed to ensure nothing goes wrong. We have budgets that may allow us to do things, but we always go back to the same 3, 4, 5, 6 people in our organizations to figure out how to implement. And so we have resource constraints that may not just be money, but it can be people, it can be expertise. And so every day we seem to be sitting on this unique balance that sits behind us. I'm going to talk a little bit about the M-Health space and how it is beginning to flex its muscle inside large organizations and medium-sized organizations. And when you start talking about M-Health, we immediately get into definitions. And so there's a wonderful book, of course, many of us have read Alice in Wonderland, and Humpty Dumpty has that great phrase where he says, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean. Nothing more, nothing less. And so in this case, when we talk about M-Health, we're really talking about the larger scale of virtual care, medical devices, mobile health, and we'll even get into aspects of how genomics play in this space. But for now, let's think about it in the broadest spectrum possible. And that spectrum is huge because it has to cut across what tendency to look at is 4 environments of healthcare. One is primary prevention. This is basic prevention of coming in for your checkup, getting blood work done, preliminary tests, doing the things you do to stay healthy. But then there's secondary prevention. And this is when something has occurred. Something has happened and suddenly you're on a regimen. And the focus is then on keeping you healthy or keeping it from occurring again, or you're on the edge of a chronic care or a chronic disease, and you need to be drawn back. So that's a secondary prevention area. And the protocols are different, and the pathways are different. And then, of course, acute care and chronic care. In chronic care, where 80% of most cost in almost all healthcare systems are absorbed. And so when you think about M-Health and we think about implementation, we have to think about it within the context across all 4, because that's what we are dealing with every day in healthcare. Now, I put this slide up for 2 reasons. First of all, one of the most basic elements of today's health and data is the use of registries. It's risk stratification, knowing what patients to see at what time, who do I need to reach out to. The second reason I put this picture up of my puppy and my son at a younger age is that generally after I put this picture up, no matter what I say, it's going to come off as good. Because it's a very cute picture, right? But what's interesting about this is that the puppy won the race to the registry. This picture is 11 and a half years old. And when this picture was taken, and it was, by the way, the first moment they met. It was the first few minutes that the two of them were introduced in the backyard, and there was sort of this bond that was being created. But what happened is that this puppy, from the moment he was born was getting notifications from his vet that said, you're due for your rabies shot, you're due for a heartworm shot, would you please come in for this checkup? They were coming in on a regular basis. Not the same thing was occurring for my son. Not the same thing was happening in our household. That's kind of weird, right? That the vet had it together and was proactively reaching out on a prevention basis more assertively than the humans in the household were. And so this lends itself to this question about where are we grabbing hold of programs across the whole continuum of care. And this is a big continuum of care. If you can't read very easily, but it starts before the waiting room, where care gap alerts and reminder services, we often refer to them as clinical decision support tools, start here in that risk stratification of registries saying bring someone in. Working their way from a waiting room where medical management and messaging is taking place, into the exam room, into discharge, and then that all-important components at home, where we start to see units of technology bring itself to bear. And those units of technology are creating what? Data. Lots and lots and lots of data. So much data that 90% of the data in the world has been produced in only the last 2 years. 90% of the data in the entire world just in the last 2 years. And the truth is that data by itself is useless. It's a whole bunch of ones and zeros that are sitting inside servers. It's only when we take that data out and we start to build it into information that it becomes valuable to us. We start to bucket it. We start to put it and transform it into pieces of data and collective forms of information that we can share and match up against a knowledge base. And this knowledge base, or the evidence-based protocols, or the guidelines of a country, or any type of quality target that you have, and when you compare information and knowledge, that's where you start to get the information that's occurring. And imagine, if you would now, what's happening with the data that comes off on every mobile device that you're using on the wristband to measure heartbeats, or your walking patterns, and all this data being collected is going into these servers at a massive basis. How much of this do we bring in to the healthcare spectrum? How much of it is pertinent? Where do you grab it from an organizational standpoint, and where is it relevant to the physician, to the patient, to the counsel that is going to have to take place? And dealing with that is what many people in IT have to deal with. Because having the information alone, this doesn't do anything with it until you can put it somewhere. So you can spend a lot of money and a lot of time between these two slides. And this is just talking about what's the data structure? What's the hierarchy of it? And how are you going to store it in servers? And what are the business operations and utilities that are a part of it? So where does this all lead? What's the point that sits behind it? How do you now take the implementation of this information and put it to work? And why is it so hard in organizations to achieve it? Well, the answer, I think, lies in this 3 points. Anyone here who has implemented anything on any scale has felt the weight of these 3 pieces: people, process, and technology. And I would argue with you that technology is the easiest piece to implement inside any organization. It is absolutely the easiest part. The people side, the cultural challenges, may in fact be the most difficult. And then when you turn around and you think of the processes that have to be devised in order to use the information to integrate just something as simple as a cardiovascular product that is catching heartbeats, that is sitting on someone, this becomes the 3 pieces that if they do not fit together, everything we're doing will fail. They will become islands unto themselves and miss the opportunity to be a part of a full and engaged protocol. This is heavy stuff. And these are all the places in healthcare that as you walk around outside and you look at the displays, think of all the areas that technology is hitting and beginning to be impacted. So you're looking at ancillary services, core delivery services, revenue cycle, mobility, foundational pieces on privacy and security, which are of utmost importance to individuals. And yet we have to take the information and use it for research in order to understand what's working and what's not working. And how do you do that from a healthcare system if you don't have the full set of information to know what is working and not working, and yet doing it in such a way to protect an individual's privacy? And by the way, how will you do that when you have to work with genetics, which is the most fingerprint-oriented explanation of a human being that walks the face of the earth? And how do you mask that in the long run when you start to pull those protocols together? These are the challenges each and every one of us are dealing with each day, and it has to be within that context of people, of process, and technology. So, and please understand, it took a long time to find a Viking ship here. It really did. But when you look at innovations, why aren't they sailing through? What's the problem? They seem to be doing so well in pilot, don't they? And then we go to input them, and suddenly the anchor comes along of both culture and regulation. And these are the two most important pieces that impact us and draw us back in. Now, the culture piece we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, or more time talking about. And that's an area where I've spent a lot of my career in trying to figure out how do you move things through on a cultural basis. And we'll focus on the physician in just a moment. And the regulatory environment has its challenges as well, because they have a very difficult balance, and we'll talk about where regulation needs to go. But let's focus for a second on that physician. Let's talk about the world that they're in and where they've come from. The traditional encounter for the last 250 years is what every single physician has been taught, and largely still taught inside medical school. Take care of the person in front of you, whether they're in the exam room or in the OR, and solve the problem that's there, right? Now, they didn't use IT, had very limited use of data, and if you go back and you look in the 1970s, there were about 300 articles a year being written in 3 major medical journals. So if you were a primary care doctor, if you were really dedicated, you could read about an article a day and keep up with the advancements in medical science. Today, there are over 3,000 articles a year being produced. White papers, research, data, new layers of information that are coming. How is it possible for any physician to keep up with this? Today, we ask them no longer to take advantage of just looking at the patient in front of them, but to manage an entire population, right? It's not a question of taking care of the patient just in front of you, but everyone who's accountable for you, which is often around 2,000 people per physician. And that's a number that varies, but when you go across the world and you look at it, it's very consistent. And you look up and we have EMRs and registries and mobilities. This all takes a team of people looking at that evidence-based protocol. Now let's talk about the change management that we're throwing our physicians into. So I like to use this story because it's personal. How many of you here have a waste bin in your kitchen? Raise your hand. Right? Is there anyone who doesn't? Right? We all have one. Okay. Now, in my household, there's 2 doors underneath the kitchen sink. There's a left door and a right door. And for years, the waste bin was on the left-hand side. Just for years, right? And every time you did something at the sink and you grabbed a paper towel or you opened up the left-hand door, you threw it in, that was that. Okay. I went away on a trip, and I missed the memo. And clearly there was a study that took place McKinsey was hired, someone was hired, and a decision was made, and the waste bin was moved to the right side, okay? And the cleaning products were moved from the right side to the left side. Never got a full explanation. Don't know if it was a regulatory issue, but something occurred. And I admit, I am not the brightest bulb in the circuit, but it took me weeks to stop intuitively opening up the left-hand door and throwing in something on what was now the cleaning products. I had to retool myself just to change. Now imagine you're a physician, you're a nurse, or you're a caregiver. And for 20 years, the moment before you walked into that exam room, you know what happened. The nurse handed the physician a packet of paper, the patient record, that the physician would open, look at, know what they were looking at, and there might even be a little sticky note at the bottom that says, don't forget to ask about Eric and how his football team is doing, right? And you would walk in, and the physician would walk in and start the conversation. And then suddenly, the snot-nosed IT kid walks in with a computer and laptop, sticks it in the exam room, offers an entire 30 to 45 minutes of training, pats the physician on the back and says, good luck, and the paper disappears, right? And oh, by the way, we'll be flooding you with alerts and extenders and clinical decision support and medical protocols, and all this is happening, and we'll give you a whole week to go ahead and make the transition. Can you imagine what that feels like? This is huge. And this is the whirlwind that we're taking an entire industry and beginning to spin it in. This is what's facing operations. This is what's facing administration to each and every one. And then on top of that, what we're going to do is look up, because we're in about 2 to 3 years of this whole curve going on in population care management. And we're going to say, that was yesterday's news. Now we're going to throw genomics at you. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look up and we're going to say, how are we going to redefine the model of team-based care based upon the use of genomics? Let's think about this just for a moment. I don't know if any of you have had a particular test. You can do them now for as little as $100 US, and you can go ahead and have your genomic test look, and it can give you your predisposition of care. But what we've learned already is that people have, because of their genetics, predispositions to certain diseases. Higher percentage likely than less. And we also know that at the individual level, we've been treating things in healthcare basically through carpet bombing. When someone is sick and we throw antibiotics at them, it's not targeted. We're basically going after everything that's moving inside the body in hopes that we knock it out. But we also know through genomics that we can manipulate certain proteins at the cellular level and start to come out with targeted pharma targets in order to hit exactly what's hurting someone. So this is an entirely different range. Do you think that's something any single physician or nurse is going to pick up from an article? Not a chance in heck. So with all of these variables that are sitting behind it, the playing field is going to move from here's the individual encounter at the physician level to take care of a population, and now take care of the population back at the individual level using an entire string of science that we're literally making up as we go along. Because the information is compiling itself at a rapid rate. So fundamental questions now get to raise themselves on primary care with physicians, which is, how do you treat at these individual protein levels? What medicine gains greater focus on the individual? And how are we going to expect people to choose where to go for practices? A question that was asked of me literally on the airplane coming over, as I noticed the person next to me studying a book called Integrated Care. And so we got into a conversation. They looked up and said, and they were Austrian. Let me add that in. They said, well, what do you think about keeping all the information at one national level? An interesting idea, and there are many benefits on a large-scale research aspect. But what does it really do? Does it take you to the lowest common denominator of research? Or do we also see, and it's an and, it's not a but, do we also see the recognition that there are centers of excellence? They're going to focus in on specific individuals' chronic care diseases and criteria. Go back to the test. Assume for a moment that I had a predisposition to Parkinson's disease. If I did, would I want to have my primary prevention in a practice that knows nothing about Parkinson's? Or do I want my primary prevention in a place where Parkinson's is a focus? And as an educated consumer that's had that test, that knows what your own predisposition would be, where would you rather be? Would you rather be in front of a GP that has a group of specialists behind them on a general basis that understand your particular disease, or in a generic space? And I would argue that we're going to see ourselves moving, because of this information, into more narrow and narrower fields of focus and depth, and that the research and the information that's going to come across is going to be critical to the research and the acceleration of that information from a medical evidence-based standpoint. Now, all of this is colliding simultaneously, and we think about the organization that sits behind it. So I want you to remember this one formula to keep in the back of your mind. Has anyone ever seen this before? So what this stands for is new technology plus old organization equals costly old organization. If you throw technology at the solution without reconstructing how the organization's going to utilize it and deal with it, you will spend a lot of money and make very little progress. And this gets back to the people, the process, and the technology pieces that we talked about earlier as the critical components of being able to move forward with innovation that is happening faster than the industry and the science can keep up with. And the patient is sitting in the middle. And we have fragmented budgets in many places between social care, primary care, hospitals, other components of government support. And it has to start with the patient and build outwards. Because if we start with the organizations and then work back towards the patient, we're going to miss our opportunity. We're not going to reinvent that organization that we talked about. We'll throw technology at something that is hard. And the regulatory balance is very tough. Because the government, and any time you're touching reimbursement, has this difficult balance to make, which is the balance between betting on new innovations that in many times are unproven but promising, while you also have legitimate but entrenched interest that want to maintain the current reward system. Now, this is precedence of an industry that is in change that we've seen before. We've seen it before in the world of e-commerce. And I would argue that healthcare falls in exactly the same space. When you're thinking about your particular innovation, when you're thinking about your software, what are you touching? Are you touching business to business because it's an EMR, and think of business to business as within the hospital, physician to hospital? Is that the space that the product is sitting in? Does it have extenders of business to consumer, where suddenly the medical record is available through a mobile device that now reaches from the hospital or the physician's office to the consumer? And what about the entire space of social media, extenders, the use of email that's taking place? If you go online and you look at how people are communicating with themselves, it is an amazing balance between not wanting their information out and writing entire blogs about every single thing that is bothering them, and often from exactly the same person. And this is happening with each and every one of the devices that are coming across. And this is just a small list. That's everything from cardiovascular to preventative measures to EMRs, etc. And so the challenge that sits in front of us is regulatory and finding the right reimbursement paths. It's cultural change of recognizing the change management piece that must be integrated. It's the new innovations that have to take advantage of data and information that needs to be compiled and back-end systems that have to be brought to bear. And this is why we are sitting inside an industry which is accelerating at just an amazing pace that each and every one of you are involved in. So I hope this sets up for you the rest of your couple days as you work through today and beyond of seeing the new innovations that are here and the challenges that are in front of you. And just to make sure that you get one more look, I'll bring Bandit back up, okay? And thank you so much for your attention.